Welcome to the first podcast of the Sports World with Patrick. My name is Patrick, and I am your host for this podcast. First, let me introduce myself. I am a 23-year-old, and I currently reside in the beautiful state of Indiana. I'm a big hockey fan, but I have been learning other sports and have been sort of going to other events. I have been fortunate to be able to play hockey. I've the recent games that I've been to volleyball games, lacrosse games, fencing events, water polo games, and I've been watching a little bit of college football and a little bit of the NFL here and there. Particularly in the NFL, I watch a little bit of the Detroit Lions and, of course, the Indianapolis Colts. So that's enough about me. So let me talk about what this podcast is about. This podcast is for those fans that don't just want to have a podcast that focuses on like just one sport or certain particular athletes and tries to get the very big interviews and try to be more of a popular podcast. Mine is more so about these athletes that, of course, are coming up, whatever they're at the NFL Combine, the NBA Draft, WNBA, the the NHL Draft, and other sports, including college athletes. And of course, we'll be looking at some of the athletes coming in to colleges, and of course the under the radar athletes, and of course athletes that might get overlooked just because they are coming from across the sea. And there will be for sure a lot of interviews with with athletes coming up here. Um, been trying to book some here for the last few days, so we will see who who or I'll see who will give me a chance to interview them, and a few of these might be online on YouTube. Still working on that at the moment. So for today's episode, since I have a little bit more of a hockey knowledge and I'm sort of learning the ins and out of other sports, so let me give you a little recap of some hockey action. First, let me catch you up on the hockey news and all the new stuff from new leagues to currently the NHL playoffs. So, first, let me start with the PWHL, which is the Professional Women's Hockey League. This is the new women's hockey league that was started up last summer and actually got announced and had their draft in June, I believe, and ended up starting their season sort of during the middle of the year on January 1st. So, of course, the PWHL is a very good league at the moment, and it's very exciting to watch them with everything that they've been doing. Of course, they have been the more uh, popular women's hockey league. Of course, they did set the women's world record for attendance at a women's hockey game, and of course, that was 21,105, and that was in the game between the PWHL Montreal and PWHL Toronto. Now, you might have heard me say PWHL Toronto and PWHL Montreal there, so let me go back a little bit. So, since the PWHL only has 6 months to start, they don't really have any team names at the moment. So, they're really trying to work with the community to find the right naming for each of these teams. So, each team is known as the PWHL and whatever city they're in. In this case, it was the PWHL Montreal and PWHL Toronto. There are four other teams, including PWHL Ottawa, PWHL Minnesota, PWHL Boston, and PWHL New York. Um, Now, of course, with this PWHL, they sort of were trying to work on making hockey a lot more interesting. Let me be honest with you on this. So they've introduced a few new rules, but there's one particular one that's caught a lot of people's attention, and that is actually called the jailbreak rule, which, of course, there's no jail in hockey, but we do have the penalty box. So if, let's say your team is shorthanded and you end up scoring on a power play, under current hockey rules, that would actually mean that the power play would continue. So instead of having the power play continue, they now, if you score a shorthanded goal, that means the penalty is over and you go back to playing on even strength. Now, there's a really good thing about this. The really good thing about this is that the fact that if you score a shorthanded goal, it's not just a stat anymore on the stat sheet. It really, it really makes it more important because that could be what makes or breaks a season, depending on how many shorthanded goals you score for your team. And of course, right now the IHF, the International Ice Hockey Federation, is actually looking at bringing some of these rules in. There is a little bit of checking in the PWHL at the moment, and of course, they're sort of learning from the SDHL in Sweden, the Swedish Women's Hockey League, and there definitely will be a lot of good to come out of the changes, possibly that come after this season. Now, as I mentioned, there is PWHL New York, PWHL Montreal, PWHL Boston, PWHL Minnesota, PWHL Ottawa, and PWHL Toronto. So there, yes, there are only 6 teams, sort of like how the NHL started with the original 6. So you might wonder, so how is this playoff going to work? Do they even have playoffs for the first year? So they do have they do have the playoffs. They are playing for the Walter Cup. I like to refer to the PWHL's playoff as the PWHL uh, playoffs. So of course, there will only be, as it was announced by the PWHL, only 4 teams at the moment will make it into the postseason, and the 4 teams that make it, of course, will go for the Walter Cup, which is what the PWHL trophy is named after. And so, actually, at the moment of this recording on April 22nd, um, it is there is only one team, PWHL Toronto, that is in first place, and they have clinched their spot in the playoffs. And they are the number 1 team in the standings as of right now. Um, so they, of course, there's no PWHL games right now until about Wednesday. Um, so everybody will sort of have to wait till Wednesday to see if they can clinch a playoff spot or not. Now, uh, of course, Toronto has already clinched it. Now, of course, there are 5 other teams at the moment that can clinch it, which is PWHL New York, PWHL Boston, PWHL Ottawa, PWHL Minnesota, and PWHL Montreal. As those standings currently sit, PWHL Toronto and PWHL Montreal will more likely be the first 2 teams to clinch. Minnesota being next, since Minnesota is third in the standings. Ottawa is in fourth, Boston is in fifth, and New York is in sixth. So it does look like maybe those 2 teams between Montreal and Minnesota can clinch here soon. The games on Wednesday are PWHL New York and PWHL Montreal, along with PWHL Boston and PWHL Ottawa. But those games, of course, start at 7. So Montreal will have a chance to clinch a playoff spot on Wednesday if they win against the New York or PWHL New York. Um, Although Minnesota will have to wait till Saturday at 1 p.m. And of course their game is against PWHL Boston. That they would have to wait until then to clinch their playoff spot. So they're sort of uh, off until Saturday. So they'll have some rest before that game. Of course, each team is playing 24 games, so uh, we're sort of coming to the end of the season. Will be interesting to see how the rest of the season goes. So another interesting thing about the PWHL playoffs is so the first overall team, or the first team, the number 1 team in the PWHL actually gets to choose their opponent. So As it stands right now, Toronto would get to choose. Actually, they get to choose either Minnesota or Ottawa at the moment as a standing stand. So they can choose who they want to play, and then Montreal would get whoever uh, Toronto decides not to pick. So this is sort of interesting. I actually really like this concept, of course. So it's not, just, oh yeah, we're going to eliminate this team. It's 14, and it's only going to be the top two teams. This could easily be 1 versus 3, or in 2 versus 4, or 1 versus 4 and 2 versus 3, which is the normal usual. I really like this setup on the playoffs, and of course, it makes it, I think, a little bit more interesting with how they sort of have this set up, because you don't really know who you're gonna play next. So that's definitely a more interesting situation to be in. So of course, only 3 more teams can clinch their playoff spots, and Montreal can be the first one after Toronto to clinch on Wednesday. And so let me go ahead and tell you a little bit about the PWHL draft for this season. So, in the inaugural season, the first ever PWHL draft, Minnesota got the first overall pick. So, of course, they got Taylor Heisey from Minnesota, and of course, they're gonna change up the playoffs, the draft this year, and so you're probably wondering what happens to the teams that don't make the playoffs. So they still, instead of having a draft lottery, they have what's called the goal plan. And so this is actually to prevent teams from tanking for the first overall pick, unlike in other sports. So they are still going to play, and they get points, and each point will count for where they can draft in the PWHL draft that will be later on this summer. And this is actually, I think, a really nice change. And for a league that is as successful as the PWHL is right now, for it being in its first season, having the largest U.S. attendance, which sits at 13,770 13,736 players, and that was broken during the PWHL's takeover weekend between PWHL Boston and PWHL Ottawa. And of course, I was there for that, and that was a really good crowd. The atmosphere for that game was just so good. Um, and of course, the more recent one, as I mentioned, when they broke the all-time world attendance of a women's hockey game at 21,105, and that was actually at the Bell Center in Montreal. And I believe they announced it to be at capacity uh, attendance, so that was actually really, really cool. And of course, that was between the PWHL Montreal and PWHL Toronto. And it was actually the night that Toronto clinched their spot into the playoffs. Now, of course, right now as it stands, Boston and New York are actually looking like they will be playing for the gold plan. So we'll see how that goes. I know that New York only has 5 more games remaining. Boston has 4. So, of course, unlike unlike in the NHL, Boston not having a team in the playoffs and Toronto having one. Of course, even in the NHL, Toronto makes it, but uh, Boston being out of it, not being able to see Boston versus Toronto, it'll be a little bit weird to not have a Boston team. But as of the moment right now, PWHL Boston is actually outside the playoffs, and they will in fact have a chance to go for it uh, later on this week. They if they beat Ottawa, they actually could tie up with Ottawa here on Wednesday. But it'll be interesting to see how that goes. So we might see Boston in there, but depending on how that game goes. That could be the deciding factor, whether or not Boston makes it into the playoffs. Um, so let me get sort of give you the overall records at the moment for all of these teams. So PWHL Toronto is 10-4, 0-7, and they do have 38 points in the playoffs at the moment. PWHL in the standings, PWHL Montreal, they through 21 games they have 35 points. They're 8-3-5-5. PWHL Minnesota through 21 games has 35 points, is 8-4-3-6. PWHL Ottawa through 20 games at the moment is has 30 points and is 8-0-6-6. PWHL Boston through 21 games has 28 points, is 6-4-2-9. And PWHL New York is through 20 games has 20 points, has 3 wins, 4 overtime wins, 3 overtime losses, and 10 losses total. So of course that's enough of for the PWHL for right now. We'll get back to the PWHL later on uh, in another podcast. So now let's go to the NHL. Of course, Stanley Cup playoffs. They have just started. Of course, all the home teams so far have won, and since 1970, for the first time since 1970, all the home teams have went 6-0. So let me sort of recap all of these scores here for you guys. The Carolina Hurricanes defeated the New York Islanders 3-1 in their first game, and the Boston Bruins defeated the Toronto Maple Leafs 5-1. Game 2 for both of those games are today. And yesterday on Sunday, the Florida Panthers beat the Tampa Bay Lightning 3-2. The New York Rangers defeated the Washington Capitals 4-1. The Winnipeg Jets defeated the Colorado Avalanche in a game that had an avalanche of goals. So that of 7-6. It'll be interesting to see if the coaches keep the same goaltending, the same lines, or will they sort of switch it up for game 2? Game 2 for those will be on Tuesday. And finally, the Vancouver Canucks, for the first time in 9 years, hosting a playoff game, they defeated the Nashville Predators 4-2. So this will actually be all that I'll have for this first podcast for the concerning hockey at the moment. So in the next episode, I'm sort of going to talk about. So I did get a chance to attend the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. I've also been working on a mock draft. Been using a few extra systems that I can sort of predict the NFL draft with. So I'm gonna definitely give you my opinion on the NFL Combine. Uh, what my opinion was on just in just in general about Lucas Oil, uh, and what it felt like to be there, just to get to know everything that was going on there, and the all the excitement of the NFL Combine. Of course, the draft this year being held in Detroit for the first time ever. So, and that will of course be this coming up on Thursday. So I'll try to get the episode out before Thursday. For this episode should air on Wednesday, and then the second episode should air on Thursday, with a third one possibly on Friday or Saturday. So just depending on what all happens in this sports world. So thank you for listening and have a great day.